Contrary to what you may think, most paranormal investigators do not read much horror literature. Perhaps not so very contrary at all, as most of the time, we actually live it. A few weeks ago, my friend Bob sent me a message on Facebook with one of the top stories here on NoSleep, and I found it natural that I should post some of my own experiences for you all. One of the reasons why I chose to write about this is the given ability to clear some misconceptions. TV channels make bank off of paranormal investigation shows, and take my word for it when I say that almost all of it is complete bunk. EVP is clever editing or just confirmation bias. EMFs, electromagnetic field detector, are useless as they mostly just pick up electromagnetic fields that occur naturally inside homes. Paranormal investigation is not fun and exciting. I'll refrain from sharing my own theories here, but all I can conclude from my 15 years of experience is that the spirit realm harbors entities of unspeakable evil. This first story details one example out of many: the House of Cross Hill. In 1999, I drove out to a farmhouse a few miles north of Greenwood, inhabited by a man named Jim. Jim was a friend of a friend and claimed his house was possessed by a demon. This friend of a friend had contacted me because he wasn't sure if Jim was actually experiencing something or merely going crazy. It was dark by the time I reached the house. I knocked on the door and was met by a ghost. The man in front of me looked exhausted, verging on madness. I was greeted into a home that clearly had not been cleaned in months. After a cup of coffee was placed at my tableside, one which I was quite reluctant to drink from, Jim told me his story. Jim had been married for 22 years to a woman named Charlotte. He showed me a picture. Auburn hair, heavy set, but with a pretty smile. They had moved to the farmhouse in Cross Hill in 1996 because their acres over by Newberry had been taken by a wildfire. They had tried for children, but Charlotte was infertile. It was only a few months into their move that they began to notice things. Aside from objects being misplaced, footsteps being heard where there should have been none, most striking was that guests, rare as they were, would claim to hear voices coming from inside the house. Even stranger was that the voices had a theme to them. Guests would often ask questions such as, "Is Melissa here?" believing that they had heard the voice of a friend named Melissa coming from another room. In the winter of 1998, Charlotte was taken by cancer, and that's when things took a darker turn. Or as he called it, it started to break me. Only a week after her passing, Jim would start hearing Charlotte's voice in the house. The first time it happened, Jim was sitting on his sofa, watching television. Then he heard a faint hum coming from the upstairs bathroom. Jim, torn up in his grief, called her name in desperation and ran upstairs, only to find the room empty. He collapsed in tears. Later that week, Jim had been outside, hanging up clothes on the rack, when he heard a distant "Jim" coming from inside of his house. Once more, with tears in his eyes, he stormed inside, finding only another empty room. At this point in his story, Jim began to cry in front of me. I don't think he had told anyone about the occurrences before, but it was too much for him to bear. I expressed my sympathies, but told him that it was only Charlotte occupying the house, attempting to make contact. "No, you don't understand," he said, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling. In the weeks following, things got worse. The sound of Charlotte became more frequent and more vivid. Each time, Jim's heart would skip a beat and he would run towards the voice of his dead wife, believing for just a second that the diagnosis, hospital visits, had all been a bad dream. Soon, the voice would start being accompanied by laughter. He'd run in, find it empty, only to hear Charlotte laughing in another room in the house. He said that in the 22 years they had been married, he had never heard his wife laugh like that. There was something sinister to it. About a month after the burial, the first farm animal died to what he insinuated was neglect. Jim had stopped sleeping because at this point, Jim had started waking up at night to the sound of knocks on the front door below. I knew Charlotte's knock. It was just like Charlotte's knock. He sobbed as I shifted uncomfortably in the chair. As he lay crying in the double bed, Charlotte would then call on him from the dark below. He said this was the first time the voice spoke more than just his name. "I'm back," it had said. A month or two later, each sign was now followed by laughter, not that of delight or joy, but that of pure malice. If Jim truly was sane prior to the occurrences, this was when Jim began to lose his mind. Framed photographs of Charlotte started appearing in places around the house. One by one, he would find them shattered on the floor. Then, one late evening by the television, he heard the voice yet again, now from the kitchen, and Jim, for the first time, completely lost it.
"I know you can't see me, but I'm standing right beside you."
"What do you want?" Jim had screamed desperately. Immediately, the television flooded with static as the lights in the house began to waver and flicker, white noise shrieking from the speaker. Charlotte's voice penetrated through the white noise, low and distorted, telling Jim to join her. It was becoming increasingly clear to me that this was indeed not a manifestation of his wife. This entity was actively tormenting Jim, and as far as I could understand, was trying to make him kill himself. I told Jim that it was going to be all right, and told him that he was dealing with a classic case of a mimic. In reality, I had no idea what I was talking about. I was also beginning to feel rather misplaced. I was either in a house inhabited by a force of true evil, or in a house inhabited by a lunatic. Either way, I wanted nothing more than to get into my car and drive back to Augusta. My conscience, however, along with my promise to my friend, got to me, and I asked Jim if he would mind if I stayed overnight. I was led to a guest bedroom. By the door, I gave Jim a hug and again reassured him that I'd do my best to help. He held on to me longer than what normal courtesy would dictate, still trembling as he had earlier. I said goodnight and Jim closed the door. In the bed, when my night vision had adjusted, I remember looking around at the walls of the room. They were covered in bears. This was not a guest room. It had meant to be a child's room. I awoke that night to the sound of Jim crying from the room adjacent to mine. What I heard next still sends shivers down my spine.
"Jim. Jim."
The voice came from the hallway right outside, but something was wrong, more wrong than it already was. The voice was low, and it was rumbling.
"I'm back, Jim."
The voice growled as it lingered outside of Jim's bedroom. Did it not know I was here? Did it not care? Neither answer was better than the other, but I knew that if I ever had a chance to help Jim, the moment was now. I jumped out of bed and flung the door to the hallway open. I was met by total darkness. Within it, I saw a shape, a figure, standing at an impossible height, towering above Jim's door. I blinked, and it was gone. The following morning, Jim and I discussed the encounter over another cup of coffee. I left early, telling him I would be in contact. 3 weeks later, Jim committed suicide. I still do not know if what I saw in the hallway was real or imagined. What I do know, however, is that no part of my imagination could have possibly produced that deep, horrible voice I heard that night. To me, the House of Cross Hill is more of a tragic story than a truly frightening one. In a morbid sense, I take some comforting in knowing that he was buried alongside of his wife, as my friend would later tell me. Some years later, while on a drive up to Greenville, I took a detour and stopped by their grave at the Baptist church. There were no flowers there.